Hello, and welcome to the Specialty Matcha podcast. My name is Ryan. This is my co-host Zongjun, who also goes by Sam. We've had some internet issues, unfortunately, so he's on WeChat on my phone. And we're the co-founders of Senko Matcha Products.
Yeah, we launched this podcast to discuss our learning journey in matcha, share startup stories, and interview experts.
And today we have Jeff Fuchs, who should need no introduction in the tea world, but I'll give a brief introduction. Jeff has documented both in film and his book, and in many different ways actually, the Tea Horse Road, which is an ancient trade route, and has walked, I think, all of it or most of it, and helped document a lot of the living stories that were there as it kind of fell out of use as we moved into the 20th, 21st century, and has been a tea explorer more generally across many different countries and cultural contexts. And I met Jeff for the first time at the Berlin Tea Festival last year. We had some very brief email exchanges 10 years ago. It's a little crazy full circle. But you mentioned some very interesting things about Japanese tea and some perspective as someone who spent so much time in Yunnan and seeing what is going on in those ancient forests. I was like, I have to go up and talk to you about this. But I guess I'll turn it back over to you and to briefly introduce yourself, and we can jump in from there.
Sure. You did a nice job, nice little bit of work describing the journey. I had a friend say this the other day, and I guess where I'm at now with the tea world is, I mean, after selling tea, writing about tea, talking tea, I guess I'm a bit of a tea advocate in whatever story shape, whatever human shape it comes in. Because I feel a lot of the informal tales and stories and narratives are somehow the most vital. We're in a time where there's an awful lot of knowledge. There's a lot of great information. There's a lot of rehashed misinformation, deliberate mystification, and there's a lot of beautifully simple knowledge that still exists about tea at ground zero, where it's grown, where the farmers worry about it every year. So where I'm at right now and where this discussion is, I guess, some sort of a tea advocacy and maybe trying to bring to light some of the, I guess, lesser aspects of tea that I feel still have a huge role to play. And every time I see you, every time we've chatted, even over a decade ago, I think I said this before we started this chat, we've been close to going down rabbit holes, you and I. There's been like this sprinkling of bait, then there's these big chasms of where we want to go with the conversation, and then one of us gets whisked away. But so it's a pleasure.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, a real pleasure for us. And also just personally, just so curious to hear your perspective because, Sam and I started our journey in Chinese tea and came in with very particular ideas that were actually probably shaped a lot by you over our learning journey. Because I feel like you're a center of gravity, especially in the West, for understanding and transmitting what's actually going on in the ground in the ancient tea forests of Yunnan and the living culture that exists there. And, I think there's a long chain that largely flows back to you and then your primary experience about the way people talk about it and appreciate it in the West. And, we're, beneficiaries of that perspective, having gone back, knowing of your work for so long. And then walking into Japan, it just feels so different in the way that they talk about the agriculture, the way they talk about the trees, the way they talk about the fertilization practices. And I was listening to your talk in Berlin last year, and you were talking about, oh wow, most of you were addressing the audience, but essentially saying, most people don't realize the intense fertilization practices that the Japanese do. And you were talking about bringing some of these marine umami expressions of flavor inland, but also, some of the downsides of over fertilization. So I know that you spent a lot of time recently in Kyoto Prefecture, in particular Kyoto Nabe, but also in places like Uji. Would love to learn some of your sort of fresh perspective after coming off of a lot of Japanese travel, comparing it to your tea experiences other places.
Yes, and it's important to mention, and you did, but it's important to mention that I'm a relative novice in the Japanese tea vernacular. My wife grew up in Japan. She was born in Japan. She's Japanese. So there's been infusions from her over the course of our relationship, and she refers to things very offhand. But her mother's family background is actually in agriculture. They were peach growers, momo. My wife has a sort of a casually eloquent way of speaking about agriculture. When I have been in Japan in the last couple of years, it's been working on this film project and working with one specific tea producer. And it's one of those beautiful little gateways into one person's life that as soon as you walk through that gate into their world, all of a sudden there's this huge horizon of information, a bit of foggy information at times, into the world, the revered world of the shaded teas, which are a huge interest, the kabusecha, the gyokuro, the matcha. And of course, there's this massive wave of matcha lunacy, interest, knowledge
Yeah.
spread. I mean, in part of this is good too, because we were talking about trends earlier. With trends, a lot of important information and learnings take place. And sometimes somebody starts with a trend, and that's the segue into going into a deeper sphere of knowledge about something. So the world of trends sometimes fixates upon one or two highlight reels without going into the depth of what creates umami, as an example. You referred to fertilizer, and I think one of the big learnings has been, and it continues to be for me, how exact and how precise this tradition is of using specific fertilizers for specific soils. And I'll give an example, just something that I can speak to with a bit of clarity. In Kyoto their gyokuro is known as a softer gyokuro. It's known as very rounded flavors, very subtle, nuanced umami. The region was covered in bamboo forests, which contributes to a high magnesium count in the soils around Kyoto. The soils also have a high iron oxide content, not higher than a lot of the regions that surround it. So the fertilizing ratio of specifics, and I'll get into what they use that I've seen them use, is very different to another prefecture. What I found particularly interesting, and I guess this goes into the umami discussion, which is another, could probably do several days worth of discussions, is that a lot of the fertilizer is herring mulch or meal. And what was amazing, fascinating, but not really surprising, I guess, given Japan's obsession with details and precision, is that certain farmers have certain suppliers of certain mackerel, herring, meal
Hmm.
that they
Okay.
import from the north of Japan around Hokkaido. They then use that meal to mix in with other components like sugarcane husk, cornmeal, to create these very specific ratios of a fertilizer with all three components or maybe two components to play with the levels that they'd like to extract of umami. So there's the shading aspect, which is vital. We I guess generally know about shade, but it's not just the shading. The shading has a very specific relationship to the fertilizer that's used.
Mhm. Yep.
And fertilizer's often been given a bad rap because it's not natural. I won't get into that discussion yet, although you may provoke me. But the idea that there's a curating of the elements that they desire to extract in the cup of a gyokuro or a high level matcha or a kabusecha, I find fascinating. I mean, it's a rabbit hole. It's a magnificent rabbit hole to go down, but there is a very specific culture, a very imbued culture of mastery of fertilization. And part of that, I think, has to do with almost a type of alchemy that a lot of Japanese tea growers have been very good at, is observing, taking the elements, measuring the elements, and being able to adapt and pivot very quickly to still extract the flavor profiles that they're looking to extract, which is, I would say, on the opposite end of a lot of the teas that I grew up drinking. living in Yunnan, they every year, every harvest, every spring would be different. Caffeine
Mm,
levels would be totally unpredictable, L-theanine levels completely unpredictable, and that's because the elements played such a role that and there was no manipulation going on in the ancient forests of it was more of the art of restraint, whereas in Japan there is a very specific art of curation, I would say manipulation to extract.
yeah. Predictable outcomes. And I guess
Yeah,
the need for control feels very actually Japanese spirited almost in a way.
very. It's admirable to be able to commit to this. Not as you say, not surprising.
Mm, yeah. And it feels like in Yunnan and a lot of these other places, the flavors in the tea starts in the forest and is controlled by nature. And like the processing happens after it's harvested, or you could argue during harvesting. And a lot of these Japanese teas, especially the shaded ones, I mean, it happened basically the whole plant's life cycle from the selection of the cultivar to all the garden management is where a lot if you trace back where these flavors are coming from, it's it's pretty different type of agriculture.
It
Yeah.
is, and it brings to mind for me a lot of the time this idea of terroir driven teas. So
Mm,
tea where you can definitely feel, not that I'm an expert because these flavor wheels in tea sometimes they befuddle me, but in a raw, explosive young sheng puerh
yeah.
from old trees, you will get a definitive terroir statement. The chi, you get it's a beautifully annihilating kind of hit. Whereas, again, with the Japanese, I find it a great counterpoint. In our household, we have these conversations all the time. Julie and we play with teas a lot, and the beautiful predictability of a high level sencha or kapusecha, as opposed to a small village in Yunnan where we've got 4 or 5 years worth of spring examples
Mm.
that are completely different, not at all similar. In fact, you could argue, unless you've purchased in the village, you might suspect they're not from,
It's a different tea.
could be from a different province. But the idea being that one is terroir driven and sort of complicit, and one is, as you said, it's post pick curated to formulate to come up with this beautifully tangible visceral ratio in the mouth.
Yeah. So it's interesting because I feel like the marketing language of these covered teas is very terroir centric. The matchas, the gokuros, you see it in the specialty marketing, you see it in the traditional marketing with these traditional blend houses and the reverence of places like Uji and the surrounding regions of Uji. And like the more we dig into it, the more we're convinced that it's not terroir driven at all. It's like the most processed tea.
You're more like literally tasting someone else's craft. It's you're tasting people actually instead of people's decision, people's preference, people's understanding instead of Tawa or nature.
Yeah. But
Well,
then, like, you could also argue that it could be theoretically grown anywhere. And, like, I think this is the best defense for the Chinese matcha producers is that if it's not a very terroir-driven tea, and China is a country that's perfectly capable of producing high-quality tea, why couldn't high quality matcha be made in China? And the reality is it's getting better and better and better. But the best Chinese matcha doesn't hold a candle to the best Japanese matcha that I've ever had. And like I think this skill gap represents, I don't have a good word for it, like secondary terroir, like the people, the
mm,
culture, the processing decisions, and sort of everything that you've been steeped in the last couple of months in your time in Japan. How would you is that a fair characterization? And like, how do you feel that from interacting with these all of these farmers in Japan for so long?
one of the things that stays with me during a recent visit was a very well regarded matcha maker who I think you're familiar with, Tsuji-san.
Oh yes, in Shirakawa.
Yes. He said this. I don't even think it was provoked by a question. He was talking and of course this was being translated, but he made mention that there's a proper way to make matcha and there's an improper way to make matcha. And I remember him going further, and I assumed, well, he was, you know, trying to keep this tradition, the regional tradition, the national tradition alive. And he actually said, no, I'm not talking about a national tradition. I'm talking about doing matcha correctly and doing it incorrectly. And it was interesting because he was very open to the idea that matcha, he understood that matcha's origins were in China during the Song dynasty. So he was aware of the history, and he wasn't covetous that only he knew how to make matcha or there's only one way to make matcha. He said there's a proper way to do it, and then there's a whole different, you know, there's a whole different segment opening up. There's food grade, organic food grade. It's being put into muffins. He's aware of that. And he said that's its own thing. What he was specific about was that when you're making a high grade, even now the idea of a ceremonial matcha seems to have been usurped because everything's ceremonial. But in the days of old, when there was a very, very, very small amount of actual ceremonial matcha, and it wasn't that long ago, available for domestic consumption,
Mm,
that there was only one way to make it. So for him, it's not necessarily where it's grown and produced. It is how it's produced
mm,
and
okay.
what is it called. So he was very traditional, very proud, of course, but he was also very open to the world of matcha. And he understood that matcha has become something almost, I mean, we had a discussion that was quite entertaining because at one point someone had said, well, matcha is almost separate from tea now because matcha and you have tea, but matcha is everywhere that tea is not, plus
Hmm. Oh, wow.
places.
Yeah,
So,
that's so true.
he was making the example of coffee shops.
Yeah.
They won't carry any tea in Japan, usually, but they'll probably have a hojicha matcha latte, or they may have a matcha latte. So he found it quite interesting, and I think he realized that matcha's doing its own thing now. It's become something bigger than a very regional, coveted, protected thing that's reverent, that's got reverence. It's now got another life of its own. It's almost like it's got a secret life beyond the borders that has transformed a lot of the language used. And I mean, just the word ceremonial now. He went on a bit of a wonderful rant, quite emotional. He said the amount of times he sees ceremonial used to market matcha, it was driving him insane because of the actual, he says it's just a word now,
Mm,
as opposed to
that's
in the past, it had again, a very particular meaning.
yeah. The word's been totally, hijacked.
Mm.
It's, it's a shame. And the ceremonial connotations. I sometimes take offense for the Japanese when, oh, you have all these Western companies calling it ceremonial grade. It's like it hasn't been endorsed by Motosenke or Urisenke. There's no one with their chame saying anything about this. Like it's just totally been hijacked, trying to sell more tea, which I guess people are in the business of selling tea, want to try to sell it, and it's understandable why people use that term, and there's demand for that term.
There
So
is.
we're stuck in this doom loop.
Yeah, especially so when they're trying to sell mediocre tea, because for higher quality tea, no one wants to use the term ceremonial grade anymore. It's all these mediocre, even bad matcha that has picked up,
Yeah.
which further stigmatize it.
Yes, and to your point, to the point you just made, I think there is an understanding, at least in the journeys, the recent journeys this year and last year's journeys to Japan. In the tea growing regions, I think there's an understanding that there are market pressures on medium, large, and small farms. All these pressures are they're hitting all of the farms, small farmers, family farms, big farms. So there is an understanding that there's pressure. I think where a lot of the farmers seem to take a little bit of umbrage and offense is with the idea that words are being used without information being provided. In other
Mm,
words, we were speaking earlier about terroir. Well, I'm sure there is a terroir component in the Japanese, in Shizuoka and Kyushu and Kagoshima. I'm sure there is information to relate to the public, relate to drinkers, but that information isn't required by the marketeers. Back
mm,
to the ideas of ceremonial, I think that has been coveted more so than explaining, well, what makes Kagoshima soil a little bit different? Because I think those explanations are things that credit the farmers for their understanding.
mm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, I totally place the blame at the traditional practitioners and the original consumption group for matcha, who really don't express any interest in the agriculture at all. Like these old school Amoto Senke or Urisenke people, they don't know anything about the product, agriculturally speaking. And, Sam and I have tried to source a lot of tencha and matcha in Japan. And like getting these objective facts that actually will determine quality and flavor are really, it feels like pulling teeth. Like people don't open up about their fertilization practices. It's very hard to actually get to the root of why a tea is good and what makes it special. So I feel like a lot of these people entering into Japan just do whatever they can because it's so hard to access this level of information, like, especially when you contrast it to, like, someone in, like, China, for example, that can be very articulate about what makes a tea good and in objective terms.
Yes, and maybe that is one of the problems with the whole ceremonial aspect has almost become a movement in itself. And I
Mm,
revere ceremony without question, but I revere it from those who've got a root system devoted to generations of teachings of a particular school and who haven't turned it into a marketing bonanza. To your point earlier about a lot of these practitioners, these new practitioners, I'd call them, who don't actually know much about the cultivars used, who don't have much interest in explaining why, for instance, a zairai, an old cultivar of Japan, maybe one of
mm,
the old originals, has a more bitter, astringent power to it than some of these more Yabukita, Gokko. These new cultivars have an almost a cure. They've been curated to provide this umami sweetness.
mm,
And I always think that information is only dangerous if you're not willing to share.
mm,
When you're trying to covet something, then the lack of information is really troublesome because it's spin. Perhaps it's maybe just ignorance, not knowing or not caring where, the origin points are, where the farmers are from. I mean, matcha for me, in my limited world, we have it at home. It's not my go to, but it's probably the least described in terms of flavor profile of any tea that we have in our home. And we probably have 30 or 40 different teas. So I've been told what a good matcha should taste like, but I haven't been given a real, and even my wife, Julie, she can read a description in kanji,
mm,
but what defines a matcha flavor profile to a large degree, I feel is ambiguous at times compared to, a baozhong oolong or a sheng puerh from Naka, which is explosive. Or so, yeah, maybe the commercialization of this ceremonial aesthetic, maybe that has actually detracted a little bit from the knowledge base or the transfer of legitimate knowledge to us on the
mm.
receiving end.
Yeah, that really resonates, and it's really up and down in both these newcomers and the old comers. The traditional blend houses, even if, like, a retail experience, you walk into, I won't name anyone particularly, but you walk into their shop, you ask, "What is this?" It's Hatsumukashi. It's Uji no Shiro or whatever poetic name. What's in it? I don't know. It's a blend. Where is it from? It's from Uji, which we've recently come to learn really actually doesn't mean that it's from the town of Uji. It can
Mm.
come from any one of four prefectures. So there's nothing to learn about that tea. There's nothing interesting about any of the teas and any of the lineups that has any bearing of reality. It's poetic names. It's a price point. Maybe if you're lucky, you get like a 2 by 2 grid to say it's more bitter or less bitter or more rich or less rich or refreshing, not refreshing, whatever their axis is. And there's nothing to cling on to as someone who wants to let the product speak for itself and like build patterns to, okay, why do I like it? What's good about it? How can I replicate this experience? How can I look for a new variety in this product positioning? It's actually no surprise to me that these newcomers cannot position the product because you go to the old players, you can't learn what's good, and unless you talk to the farmers directly, it's hard to pull out this information from people. Because some farmers too have very strong perspectives, and they don't always agree with each other. We've noticed.
No, and I we had this conversation earlier this year with an old farmer who is he is one of the top producers of gyokuro in the Kyoto region. Old
Mm,
gentleman. And he was very point blank. He said, and I love this statement, he said, I know what I like, but the new marketing has told me that what I like in a gyokuro, which I've drank, which I've consumed since I was young, is not what should be promoted. So
mm,
he said, I'm confused for a number of reasons because my version is what I was told by my master was reflecting great quality. And he said, now I listen to all of this fancy language, and he says, I don't recognize the tea I love in all that fancy language. So, and he's a tea producer, tea farmer. Simple vernacular. His teas are tremendous. His teas are ranked by a lot of producers of gyokuro in this specific region
mm,
near a village called Fuganji as being tremendous. And they all say the same thing about his tea. But sometimes these older farmers may actually have had a description that has been erased or weakened by this marketing bonanza of some of the players, the marketeers, the middle people. So rather than take the knowledge as it was and simply describe something, it's been taken, thrown about like kites in the wind, and it settles. So we're using language that sometimes confuses even the growers and the producers.
mm,
I'm sure that's not always the case, but I mean, I've met tea farmers around the world who sadly know how to do one or two things well. They're not marketing specialists, but they can tell you, they can walk into their gardens, they can tell you, tomorrow it's going to rain. That means I need to do this. In 3 days, we will start the harvest because the Japanese nightingale is saying, so they're, I feel sometimes the informal ways of the old traditions, they weren't necessarily wrong. They may not be correct either, but maybe they were not transcribed. I'm using that word lightly.
mm,
They weren't transcribed properly. And so I often feel that a lot of tea farmers feel cut out of the tea journey to the consumer's cup now. All they're expected or wanted to do, grow the tea, provide X amount. This is your quota. And in the middle, a lot of mystifying language sometimes is used. And then by the time it gets to the cup, we're not actually acknowledging the information that the farmers know very well. We're not tributing some of what they know.
yeah.
I feel like this is not just limited to Japanese tea, because when you're looking to China, like people also talk about like the idea of 新工艺, right, the new method, and that's being constantly shoved down into farmers' cultivation practice by sometimes larger companies like Dai, for example. It's constantly pushing all these like very green kind of processing to farmers that have been doing tea very traditionally in the past. So that's a so what do you think about that, Jeff? Like, do you see similarities between these two words?
I do. I've seen it in Sri Lanka. I've seen it in India, and it's a good point because in some ways it points to a wider framework of the marketing efforts of some of the bigger players in tea to sell more quantity.
Mm,
And you know your comment is I think a very good one that this isn't restricted to a region or a nation. It might be something much more global. And certainly there are tea trading interests at work that would like to keep the stock of tea at certain prices. And with those efforts comes, I think, certain language to gussy up average teas and give very, very, very simple, basic bits of information. This is a classic black. But we're not actually passing on the vital information that I think a lot of young people, especially, we're information driven now.
Hmm.
And when we don't pass on, I think, some of the grassroots information, when it's all being sieved through massive companies who are coming up with, you know, blueprints for how to market an oolong, a lightly oxidized oolong, or a heavily roasted yancha, like a stone oolong. I think what happens then is we disconnect from the origin point to the consumer. And I think the consumer knows a lot more now, certainly in the tea world, than they used to.
Yeah.
When I last saw you, Ryan, we were in Paris a few weeks ago at the Paris Tea Festival. I can never get over how many young, and I'm talking youthful 20 somethings, tea participants, tea lovers, tea heads, are willing to commit so much time, financial resources, traveling resources to learn more about tea.
Hmm.
And it's so impressive to me. It's so humbling to see a reverence to go to the source. I have friends who are now in Yunnan who spent 3 weeks finding a translator because they don't want to get more information about puerh from a distance. They want to go to the source. They want to go to the farmers. They want a translation. They're doing Google Translate. They're struggling, but their effort is so admirable because I feel like they represent a growing interest amongst youth. Youth, that tells you something about my age, but this idea that no, we want to get information that's closer to the source. We want verifiable information. We don't want all this jargon.
Yeah.
Having said that, back to your point, Sam, I do feel that there is an abundance, as always, of misinformation, deliberately rehashed, sometimes more clandestinely, trying to hide processing, ridiculously tight quotas for struggling tea farmers.
Sad.
Wow, Jeff, you have such a unique perspective, I guess, on tea because you have exposed and talked to so many people, like farmers, tea consumers, tea makers, and we have been talking about all these differences between tea making countries and regions. And I guess that's what we're most shocked at because after learning so many years about Chinese tea, our first exposure to Japanese tea was like, wow, this is just so different, so counterintuitive.
It
But
is.
I guess on the other hand, like where do you see any similarities between I guess Japanese tea and Chinese tea and maybe other regions? I'm curious to hear your perspective.
There's definitely, I mean, I'm going to make a social commentary. I definitely see a similarity in the tea farmers' struggles. I see tea farmers now in Japan really struggling to provide tencha. I see a lot of matcha in Kagoshima that's not even been shaded. There's
Yeah.
there's such a demand now for matcha. So the struggling tea farmers, I've seen them in China. Having lived in Yunnan, I was very close with a number of families who would constantly point out that the they'd ask me, how much is this tea in the West, in Europe and North America? And I would tell them how much sort of the mean average price was. And they would explain that in, let's say, a decade, what they could sell the middlemen the tea for per kilo hadn't changed more than and I'm talking less than a euro, less than a US dollar. But the middlemen were charging much more over the course of this decade. So I see yes, there's a lot of great tea projects out there that are very small, very curated, high price margins, which I sometimes support because I think it's important that if we're going to talk about coffee being sold at some of the exorbitant amounts per pound, wines will spend an inordinate amount of money on a bottle of wine that we down in a day, a meal. I've done it. But we're not yet willing to pay slightly higher premiums for great tea with a great narrative from the source. So I see a parallel with a lot of the tea farmers throughout Sri Lankan tea farmers. This was happening 15 years ago when I was there. Darjeeling is suffering a lot as well. So I see that as that's more of a socio-economic similarity. Japan has got this. I mean, we've gone on about it, but well, let's maybe go down to Taiwan briefly. That's in the late 90s and early 2000s. That's where my first mentorship began with Mr. Lee, who was from China, who had settled in Taiwan, who made dampe oolong. So he'd do these very specific roasts using different woods to smoke and enhance oolongs. Very complex. He was neurotic, beautifully unsmiling, didn't give credit very often, but like most masters, didn't feel the need to be a marketing genius. He was just really good at what he was doing. But
Mm,
he always used to say Taiwanese teas for him were marvelous because they took a bit of the Japanese structure and rigidity when Japan occupied Taiwan, but they had a real tradition that was rooted in Fujian type oolongs because of the first waves of Fujian immigrants that came to Taiwan. And he always said that there are similarities, but the differences, when the differences of the Chinese and the Japanese styles fuse, that's where the genius moment happens.
uh-huh.
A bit of the rigidity, but also knowing your tea. The Gong Fu style is all about a bit of cowboy because there's interpretations to Gong Fu style, which I love. You can go on a beautiful journey with somebody whose precision is almost demonic. And then the very next Gong Fu session, somebody's interpreting it. It's a cowboy session, liquids flying, cigarettes are going all over the place. But he always emphasized, Mr. Lee always emphasized this biaozhuan, this sort of standard. If you can make the standard mix between the rigid of the Japanese with a little bit of that messy brilliance of the Chinese Fujian style, that
Mm,
was happy ground. And for me at least, that's where I still see the similarities. In their divergent approaches, they're both brilliant.
mm,
And maybe that's the reason I don't drink so many Taiwanese oolongs, but there's something about a Taiwanese oolong when you drink a classic one with the right water and the right ambiance with the right people, and that plays a role in what we taste. I think there's something for me at least that hits a high point because
mm,
it's almost recognizing the genius of chaos and the genius of rigidity in one
yeah.
session.
It's interesting. It's actually really I've made that comparison before, especially within tea setups. Like, you can really tell a Taiwanese tea setup, like,
Yes.
pretty distinctly from a mainland Chinese one. But then I sometimes compare it to the opposite and look at sencha dough, which to me is just incredibly weird mix, except it's more if we compare it like 80-20, and like the Taiwanese style is like 80% Chinese and 20% Japanese. And then it feels like that flips in the sencha dough, where you have all this like chaojiao looking stuff being performed in a very Japanese way. It's a really weird comparison of these mixing of Chinese and Japanese culture. And the way the Japanese do that mixing is so different than what manifests in Taiwan.
Yes. And I was recently reading something where during the time of tea evolving in Japan, a lot of the merchant classes played a huge role in tea spreading into the culture of Japan because of a lot of the imported ceramics styles of serving from Korea, from China, which played a role in the whole movement of wabi sabi. And again, that's a huge topic, but some of the most coveted matcha bowls right now in the
Yeah.
old schools in Japan are actually based on old Korean, super simple, stoic rice bowls.
Mm,
And some of the more glamorous, glitzy, side handle ornamental styles of Japan, the Kyushu style, some of that was influenced by the Chinese. There was a huge fad of Chinese styles in Japan at a time. So So much of what is seemingly fixed, for me at least, is incredibly nuanced rather than fixed. There's so many influences that we don't acknowledge. Maybe that runs parallel to the conversation we had earlier about not acknowledging or not understanding enough about the baseline of where our tea comes from, who's growing it, what are the cultivars, what are the soil pH acidity relationships. So
Yeah.
maybe all of this very rigid information, I tend to subscribe to chaos theory again and again because the chaos theory is about accepting nuance that
Hmm.
was unexpected. And yeah, I might have digressed there, but yeah,
Yeah. One of the things that, we were talking about before this recording was this old tree idea. And I'm currently writing an article and I sent you a copy where I discovered some primary sources from old tea quality manuals from like the early 1900s. And I found a couple sources saying that old trees are better. Some people said you cannot make good matcha or good gokuro unless your trees were at least 100 years old. And I found various numbers, but the quality distinction, much like we see in puerh, has a lot to do with tea age. And now you never hear anyone talk about tea age. Like occasionally, maybe there's some strange farmer in like Ujitawara or Azuka that happens to have revived an abandoned tea plot that happens to have some seed propagated tea that has now reached 100 years old. And maybe they're making sencha out of it, or maybe they're making tencha out of it. But you don't hear about it. And I've had the opportunity to taste some of this tea, and it's just not classically good. And it really resonated, your story in Kyoto, where these old masters have this idea of quality, and it just doesn't match with what is considered high quality now. In the same way that I know in my heart that 100-year-old zairai tencha that was milled into matcha would never win a competition. It is just too flawed, and how our ideas of quality have drifted, and it's like has a real impact on like these farming practices. Like, is this evolution or have we lost something? And I kind of go back and forth on that.
certainly it resonates with me specifically to do with the puer world just because of, and again, there is a lot of hyperbole and deliberate, well, it's lying, it's fake teas about the age of tea trees and tea bushes in Yunnan. It's funny, your story in your article, which I really enjoyed, it made me remember traveling to Darjeeling to a garden near a very good garden called Jungpana. They make first flush Darjeelings, tremendous. And I was speaking with one of the people who is the manager of the factory there, and he said he went on this long discourse about a cultivar called what they called China. I kept hearing China, that the best Darjeelings were made from a China cultivar. Well, what they were saying, I found out, these were China cultivars.
Oh, okay.
These were original mother seeds that were stolen,
The
kidnapped,
Robert Fortune seeds.
and that a lot of the best Darjeelings, and there are some tremendous Darjeelings, are made from what they call China, which is an original cultivar. And of course, they're seed based rather than cuttings. So,
Mm.
tap roots have been going down. And we saw a couple of plants that were close to 200 years old.
Wow.
So we were there for a month going to different places. Only once did I hear about a reverence or a reverential reference to an old tree. And it was at this one garden,
Mm.
which I think the tree was 100 and it wasn't that old, but it was over a century old. But, to your point, I also am surprised that there isn't more information, more references in the description of a tea to the age of the original bush or tree. Or, in China, there's very specific taidi, sentai, gushu, laoshu. And of course, we can lie about these things, but at least there's an acknowledgement of this because each age group gives you a different profile in the mouth, a little more astringency. But yes, it's like a sea of calm when you ask in certain countries about the age of a bush. And in Sri Lanka, I think there's a practice that's quite common where they have to uproot every 3 decades, every 30
Mm,
years. They uproot everything completely because in some cases, they've overharvested. And in some cases, the soils are not as rich mineral wise as they once were. So they have to upplant or
mm.
replant.
They
So
harvest like 4 or 5 times a year there, don't they? Or sometimes
they
even
do,
more, right?
they
Okay.
do. And in some cases, there isn't even really a time of the year where they're not harvesting. So
Oh,
there's
this
kind
is
of a
continuous.
slow right. And, there's sensational teas in Sri Lanka, but it's a very different model of, let's say, revering the older trees, the older bushes, creating a storyline around some of that sumptuous information. And in fact, the article you sent me that you're working on, I'd never heard of any of this except from our mutual friend, Fujisan, who
Okay.
mentioned at one point there's a time in the not so distant past when there was the idea of gushu. He
Mm,
didn't use those words because I served him puerh. Every time I go to
okay.
Japan, I bring my stock of teas and oolongs, and I mean, I've got my cakes of puerh, and I serve them because I think it's nice for me, it's nice to share and to serve them. So much of what they do is providing me joy, so I try to serve. And I explained this one particular tea that was really enjoyed in the village, and it was a gushu from an area called Naka, which is known for very strong flavor profile, a lot of chi.
Hmm.
And I explained the idea. Well, and I showed him pictures of these old trees, and he was fascinated. He said, well, we had this to a degree, but
Hmm.
it's part of the past. That
Interesting.
was
How did he find the tea? Always been super curious if you took the best teas of a region and served them to a different sort of tea master in a different region, like, what would they think? And I had this idea for, like, a fun video project, is to record people's reactions, like a gushu pour to a famous matcha producer, which is exactly what you did, and then, like, the top umami bomb matcha to someone doing gushu in China.
right.
I'm really curious what his impression was.
He enjoyed it, and I served it to the subject of the film, and he found it fascinating. And he talked about, I don't remember exact words, but he talked about it in ways I wouldn't describe.
Hmm,
I thought they'd find it very astringent because the power of a young, fresh, even if it's an old tree, a young, explosive 2, 3 year old, sheng puerh. They didn't. They said they could taste flowers. They could
oh,
taste.
wow.
I don't
Okay.
know exactly the descriptions, but they talked about flowers. They talked about soil, that they could taste soil. So
Mm,
they were able to determine that, in my way of thinking at least, my memory is that they understood that what they were tasting wasn't manufactured, that
hmm,
it was the source material from the environment that they were tapping into. Because some of the shengpuers, people will say that if you taste it at a cooler temperature or by your fifth infusion, you're starting to get something different. That's very subjective. I don't get into that. But they didn't dislike it. And in fact, one of the gentlemen kept quietly coming, and I'd say, "Oh, which are the teas?" And he'd point at my pot. So he enjoyed it, and he said the energy, the translation was
wow, okay.
key. So he was feeling not hyper. He said it wasn't hyper, but it had a lot of what I describe as chi, or the Japanese called ki, but it had the energy, the power of, so he quite enjoyed it. And of course, the teas that he makes with the shading, he's almost diminishing those very qualities that make a tea astringent, the catechins, everything else. So I found it interesting that he wanted the energy component. And I didn't hear anyone say it was astringent, which I was
Yeah,
expecting
that's
would be.
shocking for a
I
young
was,
Shang.
yes. They love oolongs. I have to say, I've shown up with a couple of Taiwanese oolongs from friends of mine. They love oolongs, and they point out that there's a huge industry in Japan to bottle cold hojicha, cold oolongs, and sip, but something about the oolong flavor for a lot of Japanese I know, they love the oolongs, but
Mm,
they're familiar. The sheng puers, not so much.
interesting. It's very cool. I did something almost sacrilegious a couple of months ago. We are constantly sampling matcha, and I had a what was classically good uji hikari matcha, but I thought it was a little boring. So I had some danju that we got from a producer in Jingmai from old trees, and just took 1 gram of it, and I crushed it up, put it in a yixing teapot, brewed it super, super light, really just a touch of fragrance, and to extract some minerality from it. And I prepared an usacha with that water, with that tea. And I have never seen a more beautiful expression of matcha. I think it was like, because it was the texture and the fragrance of the sheng and the minerality of it without the flavor characteristics as much. And the way that those two things blended together, I was like, oh wow, maybe this is kind of close to what these old tree, like 100-year-old uji bushes might have tasted like, that had could have this deep taproot and were shaded and could have a much more interesting expression of minerality.
I mean, what you're doing, I mean, it may be sacrilegious, and 10 years ago, I would have probably shut the screen off at this point, but I think what you're doing is actually part of how tea moves forward. I just had we just hosted 21 students from all over North America, Mexico, and I have something I do called Tea Time. We have a nonprofit here, and I serve them tea, and every time I serve them tea, let's say 1 or 2 out of each group of, let's say, 20, 25 people will have had decent tea, the rest, no. But every time I serve a decent tea, and I don't serve plonk, I learn something from them about their interpretation of what they're tasting or feeling. And I think one of the great learnings that I've taken in the last years is to never refute how somebody wants to progress with something or experiment with something, because it is often in those little tweaks and sacrilegious moments that we take this beautiful leaf that we all adore, we take it forward somehow. And, what you did there is a bit of alchemy. You decided to there's a it wasn't a barista, it was a bartender. He was a mixologist. He was working in Hong Kong, a Polish gentleman. He was mixing high-end teas with, gin, with martinis, and I said, "There's no way I'm drinking," because at that point in my life, I was gonna drink tea. I would do a martini, but I was not doing them in the same setting, and in the end, I did. And some of what he was doing was breathtaking.
Hmm.
And to your point about throwing a bit of Jingmayan with a little uji hikari matcha, maybe that's also where we should be encouraging people, is to, throw away the book of rules. And because ultimately, I think this is what disappoints me sometimes about people who are trying to put this rigid structure on tea. I think it's important to understand how to take a pure tea and proper temperature, proper reverence for the cultivar, understanding. It's like chefs talk about an omelet. Before you go creative, make
Hmm.
sure you base omelet done right. So understanding what a great baseline, semi lightly roasted oolong should be. But after that, I think this idea of a sense of play, a sense of taking another journey with something, I think there's something quite positive and exciting about the results, and they won't
Hmm.
always work.
No,
But
I've since replicated this experience with some other experiment, with some other tea. And somehow, on the first try, I stumbled upon 1 plus 1 equals 4. Honestly, it wasn't even 3. It was so magical what that did, because I felt like the deficit of that tea, what I felt is a little bit of a deficit, was just so perfectly balanced. But then I tried replicating it with some other teas, and it's like, yeah, doesn't work. So,
well, and it's like that old idea of sometimes the best tea times aren't actually a tea time with the best tea. I think a lot of these moments of exploration are subjective, and that we have a different palate to someone sitting across the table from us. We have a different enzymes, different blood type, different
Totally.
acidity levels. So sometimes a sense of play is just that. It's not. It takes away this rigid notion of overly formulated rules that have been come up with by people who are maybe merchants and trying to sell us something. So good for you.
Thanks. Is there anything that we didn't touch on that you would like to talk
No,
about?
just No, just maybe a little something, and it's simply because I know a little less about this part of the world. We were talking about the whole fertilizer question in
Hmm.
Japan, and through some research, through a friend of mine doing some research in Japanese literature, there is this idea that I think what's interesting about the whole umami flavor profile, this sea sort of this tribute to salt and sweetness throughout the research I've been doing and a friend has been doing for me. There's this idea that the Japanese identity has always been tied to the sea, even in inland regions. So this idea of importing a sea flavor, a sea essence with their kombu, with their seaweed,
Hmm.
this has always been present in the Japanese literature and culture. And there's a song, in fact, that sort of pays tribute to the sea. It's Ware wa umi noko. Basically, it's a patriotic song, but it pays tribute to the pride that people feel in the ocean and for the bounties of the ocean. And when Kyoto was a hub in Japan, back this is all tying into fertilizer and bringing in herring from Hokkaido in the north of Japan into fertilizer. When Kyoto was one of the great hubs, they had something called the Mackerel Road or the Saba Kaido. It was an actual trade route that brought mackerel in from the Wakasa Bay, I think, to Kyoto. It also brought salt in because of these flavor profiles that were so revered and desired. And so it kind of ties into the mystery of fertilizer and this umami. There is a bigger story there, and your article touched on it, and maybe some of this history in literature making reference to the sea. Maybe
Hmm.
that ties in and answers some of the questions that these are nuanced questions, but maybe it ties into these flavor profiles that are coveted and are sought out in the creation of these teas.
Yeah.
Well, with our own research, like back in the days, matcha was fertilized with human manure that was collected in Uji City, and the manure, especially coming from richer families that consumes more fish in their diet.
From digested mackerel.
Yeah, to fertilize tea.
Mm.
That's
It's the original regenerative permaculture model, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a sustainability model right there.
Yeah. Very circular food economy in the best way. It's
Mm,
the Japanese had it figured out all along.
I
So
did.
now we just pump the soil full of ammonium nitrate. At least in the the less artisanal side, which is a little sad.
did they start using like actual fish and seafood as fertilizers in Japan?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's probably in literature. I have asked the question about when these, because it's such a specific science to me, that you get a simple tea farmer, but he's got an amazingly detailed logbook of the ratio of in this part of it, in the garden that's in that prefecture, there's a ratio of herring, cornmeal, sugarcane
Mm,
husk.
yeah.
In that prefecture, it's totally, well, it's not totally different, but it is very demonstrably different. And when I asked him about this, I got a very vague answer, and I'm not sure he was sure.
Mm,
But
interesting.
it would be fascinating to detail the evolution of this very complex and sustainable or not method of fertilizing.
I guess is one last question. I'm curious, what are your biggest discovered curiosity gaps or knowledge gaps that you've discovered that you have after spending all this time in Japan and talking to people, learning about shaded cultivation in Kyoto and also in Uji and the surrounding regions. Like, what makes you the most curious now, with all the context that you've have learned in preparing for in shooting this film?
Two, I think two things come back to me again and again. One is we've talked about it during this quite wonderful chat. One of them is the detailed approach to creating, eliciting a flavor profile within a plant,
Mm,
using and being able to adapt the soil, the shade, the curation, manipulation, the steam to create something so very specific. Again, it doesn't surprise me that the Japanese do this because they have, methods of cooking puffer fish. They have used seaweed in so many different ways, spectacular, subtle. So I'd say it's the dedication to eliciting a very specific and desired sensation.
mm,
And I guess another one is that this goes back to the farmers and maybe this idea of chaos that I cling to is that within all this detail and within all of this curation, within the Japanese tea farmers and the Japanese psyche, I think, there is such a sense of the pending power of nature. There's all these references with the earthquakes to the tsunamis to typhoons. They've been inundated by natural disasters,
mm,
but they've managed to always. So I found this, and I find it a wonderful counterpoint to being inflicted with all of these things from the outside, and yet being relentless in refining a structure and a technique to elicit something very specific. It's
mm.
kind of like you've got the chaos of Typhoon Alley, earthquakes, tsunamis, and on the other hand, you have this ability to cling to some sort of sense of detail and
Yeah,
reverence.
like exercising the agency within the domain they control. It's like almost it's almost stoic. It's,
Very much. In fact, I almost used the word stoic. It's an understanding that there's so much that's uncontrollable.
mm,
So it almost has pushed people to the opposite of what you'd expect. They're not giving up the traditions. I mean, they are. We all are. We're giving we're giving a lot of ourselves away to fast and easy, and I'm that's another discussion. But I think those two things, this idea of eliciting something so specific and this commitment to adapting and pivoting very quickly in a world that's shown them very little mercy at times in terms of natural disasters.
yeah, that's interesting. I've never thought about that.
My mentor, Mr. Lee, though, gave me the best mantra. It'll be with me until my son will have it. He, after 2 years of studying with him, he said very unceremoniously, I found it very cold, but he just said, "Now that you know all this, forget it and go drink some tea."
Uh,
It's been fun.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much. And to our audience, thank you so much for listening. And if you enjoyed this, please consider sharing with a friend, and we'll see you in the next one. Take care.
Ciao,
Bye.
ciao. Bye.